Welcome back. When we left last time, I had just finished that Texas had declared its independence, and they have captured the President of the Republic, the General Santa Anna, and now they have to decide, the United States has to decide what to do about this, because although there was some mixed feelings within Texas about whether they wanted to be part of the United States or not, most people there wanted to be annexed by the United States to become part of the U.S. And that included Sam Houston, who was a friend of President Jackson. And this is now 1836. Jackson is in the last year of his second term. So it's a problem for the United States. And what we did was, first of all, we did agree to take General Santa Anna and then transport him to exile in Cuba. The United States Navy transported this Mexican general, who had been ousted by the government of Mexico. The people of Mexico had in their own way had decided not to continue to accept him as their president. He was very unpopular in Mexico, having lost this war and this battle and lost a lot of men and so forth. So he was going to go exiled in Cuba. And to get there, the U.S. arranged to take him off the hands of of General Santa Anna of General Sam Houston and the Texas rebels, and actually provide him with transportation to exile. So we got involved, and we were working with the people in the Republic of Texas, and helping them in their cause. But even President Jackson, who, as I said, was a friend of Houston and was definitely an expansionist, he would have liked to have acquired that territory. But he realized, this is now 1836, the abolitionist movement is only of the sort of what I call the new abolitionists, led by William Lloyd Garrison. We're only 5 years into their campaign, but already the issue of slavery had become a very tense one in the United States. And it's still a very sensitive issue. And Jackson knew that if he proposed to annex Texas as a slave state, there would be tremendous opposition to it from the North. And as I've said when we talked about slavery, it's not because they objected to the institution of slavery. They would have feared the additional slave state would upset the balance of power in the Senate. It would mean that slave states had an additional 2 senators, and that South would have more votes in the Senate then. And they're afraid of the idea of introducing slavery into new territory, where and part of Texas is amenable to slavery. The eastern part, is a generalization, is amenable to cotton. You can grow cotton there, so you can have slaves there. But much of the rest of the state is pretty bleak desert. And do you want to have slavery allowed there? And that would be a very sensitive issue. So Jackson just decided to drop the issue. He didn't want to confront that. He didn't want to have a big political furor in the Congress if he proposed annexing Texas. And the same was true for Van Buren, his successor, elected in 1836, for the next term. Now the next president, well, not counting Harrison, who died a month after his term began. I don't know if I mentioned that in my last lecture. I can't remember. But Tyler became president within a month because Harrison died. Tippecanoe died, so then we got Tyler too. And as I told you, Tyler was ended up as sort of a man without a party. He had no political support he's a Whig, but the Whigs have disowned him. So what does that leave? Well, it doesn't leave anything. So actually, Tyler was going to try to figure a way to annex Texas into the United States, but he just never could quite carry it off because of the political situation. So that's where that stands. Well, in the age of manifest destiny, and with President Polk as an unabashed advocate of manifest destiny, his campaign for the re-annexation of Texas is kind of a subtle jog that supposedly we had already annexed it, but we're just going to re-annex it. He didn't call the annexation of Texas, he called it the re-annexation, which is kind of a political trick, but it's a way to get around the issue, and it's a very popular campaign issue, and the whole issue is now very popular. And so Congress, in January of 1845, or January, February, before the inauguration of President Polk, in those days the inaugurations took place on March 4th. If you know, today they take place on January 20th, but under the Constitution at that time, the official date for the inauguration was March 4th. And so a month before he even became president, Polk has achieved one of his goals. Texas was annexed. There was opposition from many Northerners. Many Whigs objected to it. There was the debate in Congress was very intense. But when all was said and done, Congress voted with a Democratic majority, with Polk coming in, with manifest destiny obviously very, very popular. I mean, that was why Polk won, was because he had embraced it, and neither Clay nor Van Buren did. So Congress saw the handwriting on the wall, and although there was opposition on the issue of slavery, manifest destiny sort of overshadowed slavery, so Congress went ahead and annexed Texas. So we added Texas to the Union, and a couple of weeks later, when he was inaugurated, Polk had already accomplished one of his goals of annexing Texas. Now, his other campaign slogan was the reoccupation of Oregon. And again, he's using that it's implying there. A little background on Oregon then. Now, I think I mentioned to you back in the days when I was looking at the aftermath of the War of 1812. In 1818, the United States and Britain had signed a treaty which divided the area from the Great Lakes to the Rocky Mountains along the 49th parallel. And that is the border between the United States and Canada today. And that had been established by a treaty in 1818. The treaty also provided, though, that for the area west of the Rocky Mountains, west of the Continental Divide, which in that area runs down through Montana and so forth, west of that, Oregon country would have what was called joint occupation. That is, both British and American citizens could go there and do whatever they wanted to do, and it would be sort of open to both. So that's joint occupation. It's the idea that we're not going to settle that area, we're going to have it be open to both. And that Oregon country, as it was defined in that treaty, and then a year later, the treaty of Adams-Onis Treaty, when the United States purchased Florida and made a treaty with Spain, the Oregon country, as it was called, or Oregon Territory, or whatever, extended from the 42nd parallel, which is the modern-day boundary between California and Oregon, if you want to look at a modern map, out to the Rocky Mountains. That would be the eastern boundary, the Rocky Mountains, or the Continental Divide. On the west, the boundary would be the Pacific Ocean. And on the north, the boundary would be the latitude 54 degrees 40 minutes. And the boundary between the United States and Canada was the 49th parallel. But that only went up to the Rockies, and then so this Oregon country extended to what is now the states of Oregon, Washington, most of the Canadian province of the British Columbia, as well as Idaho, parts of Idaho and Montana. That would all be included in the Oregon country, and it's jointly occupied. Well, joint occupancy worked fine because there were no real permanent residents in the area except the Indians, and as we know, they don't count. We don't pay any attention to them. We sort of pretend they're not there. And the people who were there, the only white people who came into that area were fur traders, and they're only engaged in the fur trade. They established fur trading settlements. There were a couple of American fur trading companies that were active in the area, and they had fur trading posts. The British had one company. The Americans had several companies. The British had only one company. They granted a monopoly to the company, the Hudson's Bay Company, and they also had trading posts within the Oregon country to trade with the Indians for the furs. And the two sides are commercial rivals. I mean, we're trying to get the Indians to trade furs with us, and the Hudson's Bay Company is trying to get Indians to trade with them. But there's no real permanent settlement, so you don't have to worry about such things as which is the actual government for the territory, who's going to provide local government, and such specific things as who's going to issue land titles, because there's no permanent residence there. So you don't have to worry about those kinds of things. So the Oregon issue is settled. Oregon country is there. It's jointly occupied. There are American fur traders there. There are British fur traders there. And they just sort of each have their own little trading areas, and they have their own Indians that they would trade with and so forth. And it works fine. Then around 1842, 41, 42, about the time that the term manifest destiny came into use and became a very popular item in the United States, about the same time, Americans started to settle in the Oregon country. They went on what was called the Oregon Trail. You may have heard of that. The Oregon Trail went from, depending on where you want to start it, the one place that started is in St. Louis with the arch, the Gateway to the West arch. If you've ever seen pictures of that and you know about that supposedly that gateway is the gateway to the West. And so you'd go up the Mississippi, up the Missouri River, and then over the mountains, and we could trace it out. But there's the Oregon country, and people started settling in Oregon, especially in the area south of the Columbia River, which is the modern day state of Oregon. There's some valleys there that are very productive for agriculture, and so Americans started to move into that country, and now these are permanent settlers, and these are people who are going to want to have, as I said, such things as, local governments, and somebody to set up courts to deal with land disputes. Somebody's got to run a court system. You've got to establish a court system, and somebody's got to be responsible for that. And just a specific thing, which is kind of a legal technicality, but it's one that's necessary when you have people settling land. Somebody has to issue the official land titles and deal with all of those specific nuts and bolts issues of running a local government. So with Americans moving in, there's a great deal of interest in this area, and Polk capitalized on that politically with his campaign in 1844 for the reoccupation of Oregon, and he was going to say, "We want Oregon." Now, frankly, all the United States really wanted to do was to extend that 49th parallel, which is already the boundary between the United States and British Canada, east of the Rockies, just extend that west to the Pacific Ocean, or to Puget Sound in the modern day Seattle area. Just extend that west. That's a simple, obvious solution. And frankly, there are Americans that are starting to settle in the Oregon country, but most of them, almost all of them, are south of the 49th parallel, and as a matter of fact, they're even south of the, even further south into modern day state of Oregon. Not much around what is the modern day state of Washington or Idaho or Montana. There aren't very many settlers there. And the attraction is the fertile land of Oregon, of eastern Oregon, on tributaries of the Columbia River. So really what we want is that area. But Polk then started to negotiate with Britain over this, and initially Britain seemed to be hostile to the idea of relinquishing control of any of the Oregon country. In order to kind of move the English along, Polk started a campaign with the slogan 54-40 or fight. There were newspapers that started advocating that. American congressmen started to demand that. And the idea was we wanted to take the entire Oregon country, which was not really true. We really didn't want that, all of it. We only wanted the part where Americans were living. We didn't want the area north of the 49th parallel, all the way up to 54-40. But it was just a kind of a slogan that was designed to intimidate Britain and force them to come to the negotiating table. And frankly, Britain didn't really care about that. I mean, that's a long ways away and very inaccessible from Britain. They don't have much use for that whole Oregon country anyway. So in 1846, the United States and Britain signed a treaty establishing the boundary at the 49th parallel, as I say, extending it, as you know today, extending it from the Rockies over to the Pacific Ocean, and the United States acquired the whole Oregon country. And so Polk had accomplished his second objective. He's acquired Oregon. And it's a little bit of it's not that great a deal because, as I say, England really wasn't interested in it. And we didn't really want all of it. We only wanted the area south of the 49th parallel anyway. And that was just an obvious thing, and so it worked out fairly easily. And it was not a big deal, but Polk got it, so he's now accomplished that. Now we come to his third objective, which was not one of his campaign issues. He didn't talk about it because it would have been politically incorrect to use this as a campaign issue, but he always wanted a third area. And to simplify, that third area was called, some of you may have heard of it, California. He also wanted California, and then in fact, just throw in the area of the Southwest, the modern day states of New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, and part of Colorado, everything between Texas, which he's acquired, and the actual modern day state of California. But we'll just say California and include everything else in the general area. The whole Southwest is basically what he's talking about here. And really he had his eyes on that for a long time. He just never talked about it. So let me give you a little background on California. And some of you may know about this because you've probably taken some California history in fourth grade or whatever. So you may know about this, and you've probably all heard of Father Serra. The Spanish had settled California starting in 1769, and they used a standard way that they would do things is to have missionaries go in and try to convert the Indians and establish a Spanish presence in California. They'd been claiming California since the 1540s, but it was far away and it was not easily accessible, and there just wasn't much there. So they had there'd been a lot of Spanish interest in the area, but nothing had come of it. They just hadn't ever really gotten around to it, and there was nobody doing it. So then they said, well, let's have the religious people go in and establish settlements there but just focused on communities of Indians, and we'll convert the Indians to Catholicism and make them into Spanish settlers, and we'll have them have established Spanish towns in California, with the mission as the sort of the leading way of settlement. And for many years, that was all that there was just these the missions established ranches. Eventually, some Mexican people acquired ranches in the area, and the Mexican government would allow that to go on. And so the missionaries were very unhappy about it, because they wanted to have the Indians still hold that land, and that was their vision of California, was a vision of Indian communities, with the church as sort of a focus of the center of attention of the community, but just basically have Indians learning Spanish, learning Spanish agriculture, completely changing their whole culture from a native culture to a Spanish culture. But that was the Spaniards' goals. And if any of you know that this is a very controversial subject, there's a great deal of controversy about Father Serra, and I could talk about that, but I'm going to just skip that over. That would take a long time to go through, and that's a very important subject in and of itself, and I can't do it justice, so I'm not even going to start. I'm just going to pick it up in terms of U.S. history, because about the 1830s, about the same time that Americans, Anglos, are settling in Texas, Americans are also settling in California. And so there are Americans coming then about the same time as along the Oregon Trail, the early 1840s. Americans are coming to California. It was more difficult to get to California, and there was no real obvious California trail in the way that there was an Oregon Trail. Going to Oregon, there's really sort of only one way to go, and everybody went the same way, and that was it was a difficult trip, but it was doable. To get to California, there's no one way that everybody agrees is the absolute best way. There was no absolute best way. And California, although it was very attractive for agriculture, and there was certainly good farming along the Sacramento and San Joaquin rivers in the modern day Central California, the Central Valley, and that was where most people were going, where most Americans were going. But the legal issues were a little bit complicated there, because technically that was Mexican territory. It was part of Mexico. California was a territory within the Republic of Mexico. Whereas Oregon was just sort of open country, and it was easy to go to, and it was just a little bit easier. And so there were people would go across the plains, and then they would get to a certain point out, and just before they started to go over the mountains, and most would go over the pass to Oregon. Some would go down south, but some of them had trouble, and you may know that there was one party of people going to California that ended up marooned in the mountains, and they ended up having a great deal of hardship, and they ended up, in order to survive, eating human flesh. That was the Donner Party of 1846. So that was tough, and so it was harder to go to California, but people are doing that. People are going to California, and they are living there illegally on land that they do not own, under Mexican law, only Mexican citizens could own land. So these people cannot own land. And they are just settling there as Protestants in what was officially a Catholic country. And they are living there without legal status of owning the land. They are simply illegal aliens in California. But there's a great deal of interest in that and a great deal of desire by Americans as part of manifest destiny to acquire that land. There are, of course, Mexicans in California, and they are landowners. They have big ranches. But now more and more the people who are coming to California are Anglos. And they are not living the way Mexicans in California had been living forever. Most Mexicans were engaged in cattle raising. They had big cattle ranches, and that was their main activity. The Americans who are coming in are engaging in commercial agriculture, and they're looking for ways to export their crops, just as Americans always do. Now, Americans are also interested in California for another reason. And this is a larger picture. To understand the whole picture of why Americans are interested in California, you have to understand that there's also a great deal of interest in the United States in trading with China. Europeans and their descendants in America have been interested in trading with China for many centuries, as you may know. I mean, you know, going back to the days of Marco Polo in whatever, the 12th century or something. And you know that one of the reasons why Columbus was trying to find a way to sail west was because he wanted to trade with China. There's a great deal of interest in trade with China for many reasons. And, you know, China has a lot of resources that Westerners would want, people in Western Europe, and now including the United States. And it's the largest country in the world, and so it's an obvious market for Western goods. So people are trying to find ways to trade with China and find ways to dispose of American or Western-made goods in China. So there's a great deal of interest in trade with China, and this is just something that's the Americans are part of what has been a worldwide issue for centuries. People from the West, including Western Europe and now the United States, want to trade with China. And we are. Americans are trading with China. It's a very difficult trade. You have to, if you're going to sail from the east coast of the United States, from New York or Boston or wherever, and you want to sail to China, you have to go all the way around South America. A long, long trip. Very difficult trip, getting around the southern tip of South America. Encounters some very hard weather. There's a couple of different ways to go through there. All of them are very hazardous. They're all very, very hard sailing. It's a long, long ways, all the way to China. So it's a very, very difficult trip. And here in California, in San Francisco, is one of the world's great natural harbors. It's an obvious thing to acquire San Francisco and be able to trade from there, take a couple thousand miles off the trip to China. Instead of sailing from New York and having to go all the way around South America, if you could start at San Francisco, you make the trip much easier. So as part of the interest in trade with China, which is a whole nother topic, there's an interest in acquiring California in order to acquire San Francisco Bay. And so that becomes a big target of American interest, is San Francisco Bay. As a matter of fact, in 1836, Andrew Jackson was interested in acquiring San Francisco Bay. So he tried to purchase Northern California from Mexico in order to have access to San Francisco Bay. He wanted to acquire the area just from San Francisco Bay, which is about at the 38th parallel, to the 42nd parallel, which is the boundary between what was then Mexico and the Oregon country up there north of the 42nd parallel. And he just wanted to come down to San Francisco Bay, because the only thing he wants in California, the only thing of value in California as far as he was concerned, was San Francisco Bay. So he tried to negotiate for that, but his negotiator went to Mexico and announced to sort of the whole diplomatic community there that he was there to buy California, or at least Northern California, and really the only thing I say they wanted is San Francisco Bay, to buy that from Mexico. But the way he's going to do it, and he just made no secret of this, he was just blatant about advertising it, the way he's going to do it is by bribing Mexican politicians. And he's not going to spend money on buying the land, he's going to buy the political leaders. And by having, owning all of these political leaders, he's going to be able to acquire California, and that's his goal. And he was just open about it, he was just blatant about it. And this was highly insulting to Mexican politicians, and frankly, Mexican politicians would have been, probably many of them would have accepted bribes and would have been willing to give away California if they got enough money in their own pocket. But you can't advertise these things, you can't make it public that that's what you're doing. And supposedly, the sensible way to do it, if you really want to do it, you do it secretly, and then you just make some announcement that say, oh, well, these honest politicians of California have made a good agreement in selling California, or selling San Francisco Bay. And I don't think I mentioned, but actually most of the ranches in California, most ranchos, were in Southern California. Ironically, one of the largest city in California was Los Angeles, which was an odd place to be because there's not really a natural harbor there. That's not a good harbor in its natural state, interestingly enough. San Francisco is an excellent harbor. San Diego is a good harbor too, but there's not a natural harbor at Los Angeles. And yet that was the largest city because most of the ranches were in Southern California, and that was the place where the ranchers would take their cattle hides. That's what the trade is, it's cattle hides. They would take it to the port of Los Angeles, such as it was. It was a very poor port, very hard for the American shippers to come there. But that's where people went, which some Americans noted. They said, wait a minute, this is crazy. Here they've got this natural harbor, this great natural harbor, which is hardly ever used. Instead, they're going to a place where there is no natural harbor. And Americans commented on this, and this was a subject of some discussion in the United States, how stupid the Mexicans were, that they didn't use this great natural harbor. Instead, they wanted to use Los Angeles, which is not a harbor, and it just shows that they're not really making good use of the resources that they have there. And as you know, that becomes a justification for saying, well, if they're not using it right, well, then we should have it. And so people have been thinking about that. People are saying, California should belong to us because we'll use it right. We'll use it to have a big harbor at San Francisco and have a lot of trade with China. And then we'll have all these Americans living in the Central Valley, bringing their products down the Sacramento and San Joaquin rivers to the San Francisco Bay and exporting it, and we're going to develop it, and it's going to be this modern Anglo community, and we're going to do it right, and these stupid Mexicans are not. So as you know, as I said, that's an excuse for taking somebody's land. If you don't think that they're using it right, that's then our justification. That's part of manifest destiny. we're going to use the land right. That's why we should have it, should belong to us, because we'll use it right. We'll use it the way that you're supposed to, which is English agriculture, Anglo agriculture, the way it's been since the days of Jamestown. We're going to have small farmers in here, and we're going to be engaged in commercial agriculture and so forth. This is the whole image of that Americans have of themselves and why they're superior and why they deserve this land. So there's a great deal of interest in California in the United States, but it's a very sensitive subject, because if you propose to buy it, the Mexicans are going to assume that you're coming in and bribing, and that's just insulting, and it's something that no Mexican could politically take advantage of. Even if a Mexican argued that we really don't use that area of Northern California up there. That's not where our main settlement is. Most of our people are living in the South, in Southern California. So let's just sell that northern port and Northern California, which we don't use. But if you suggest that, everybody's going to assume that you're taking a bribe, and that's going to be politically destructive, so nobody can do that. Nobody can say, let's just sell California. So, there's no way that you can sort of do that. Well, Polk, though, says we're going to try to figure out some way to get California, and we're going to figure out a way to do this. And he developed a multi-pronged effort to acquire California. One of the things he's going to do is send a negotiator, a guy named John C. Slidell, to Mexico City to try to negotiate a purchase. And this is and Slidell, Mexico wouldn't even receive him, because they've cut off relations with us as a protest against what's happened in Texas. Mexico's official line was that somehow the United States government was responsible for the Texas revolt, which may or may not have been true. We don't know if President Jackson secretly gave some aid or whatever to his friend Sam Houston. But anyway, Mexico is mad at the United States for the fact that Americans have acquired Texas. And then especially after we annexed Texas, they said that was illegal. They still insisted that was Mexican territory. So Mexican is very angry about that. And Mexico would not even receive Slidell. They would not even accept him, especially because he's come down there to, buy California, and that's a very sensitive thing in Mexico that, raises this whole issue of bribery from the days that Jackson's negotiator had tried to acquire California. So that's not going to go. But that's an effort. That's one of the things that Polk is doing. He sends Slidell down there, and he says, negotiate a purchase of California, see what you can do. And then that effort failed entirely. A second effort was that in California there are a number of Americans living there. The people who are there most of them are in the Central Valley as farmers, but there are some Americans living in the cities, and they're mostly engaged in negotiating trade. There's a small but very prominent American community in Los Angeles of people who work for the American companies that are trading with California, and they're in several ports, including Santa Barbara. In the port of Santa Barbara, there's an American named Oliver Larkin who is there engaged in trade. And so Polk made him a consul, gave him a status working for the United States government, and then it's complicated, but he tried to send a message to Larkin to work with some of the Mexicans that he does business with. I mean, Larkin, like these Americans who are engaged in trade, they have friends and contacts within the Mexican community because that's where they get their product. That's who they trade with. They work with people with the Mexicans in California, and they negotiate deals and acquire the hides for export and bring in the American products that they're going to sell then to the Mexicans. And they're just businessmen involved in trade. They're merchants involved in trade, but they know Mexican leaders. They know the Mexican community. They're almost all bilingual. Many of them ended up marrying Mexican girls. Larkin did not. Larkin was like the only one of all of these Americans there who had an American wife. He came with his wife. Well, he got married on the ship, bringing him to California. He married the captain's daughter, but he has an Anglo wife. But he's the only one who has an Anglo wife. All these other Americans who were there, engaged in trade, living in these cities, they're all part of the Mexican community because they interact with the community. They have ties. They speak Spanish. Some of them even became Mexican citizens. Some of them became Mexican landowners as citizens. They're different from the people that are coming in the Central Valley and are farmers and are just, as I called them before, the illegal aliens. So there's this whole group of people up there in the Central Valley who are not part of the community, but there's this small number of Americans who are part of the Mexican community and mostly living in the cities because that's where the trade is. So what Polk instructs Larkin to do is to work with the Mexican community of California and to try to encourage them to declare their independence from Mexico. Now that's not an impossible task. Many of the Mexicans who live in California, and many of them didn't really identify themselves as Mexicans. They have little tie to Mexico. They're a long ways away from Mexico. They have few ties with Mexico or with Mexicans. Actually, they call themselves Californios to distinguish themselves from Mexicans. They don't consider themselves Mexicans. They consider themselves Californios, and they're married to Californio women, and they have Californio children, and so forth. So they are much closer to they're actually sort of involved with. They have more contact with the United States than they do with Mexico. They have more contact with England than they have with Mexico because of trade. They're heavily involved in trading with. There's a lot of trade with Mexico and Europe, and there's also Europeans living in California engaging in trade. So there's a fairly substantial foreign community in Mexico, and it interacts with the Mexicans, and some of these Mexicans say, let's declare our independence from Mexico. We don't have ties to Mexico. Mexico doesn't care about us. We're far away from Mexico. We're hundreds of miles away from Mexico, and there's little communication. It's a long ways. It's a very hard way to get from California to Mexico. Let's just take advantage of and declare our independence and ask the United States to take us over. So in fact, the idea of encouraging Mexicans to do it is not impossible. So that's Larkin's task, and he sets about it. He's going to work on that and hope that actually helps. So that's a second effort that Polk is making. It's sort of a second way to accomplish his goals. He's going to try to encourage Mexicans in California to, on their own, rise up and declare their independence from Mexico and follow the Texas Trail and establish an independent Republic of California, and then the United States will annex it. The Texas model. So that's a second way. Third way is to send American troops into a territory between the Rio Grande and a river to the north that's called the Nueces River. There's a little strip of land there along the Gulf of Mexico between the Rio Grande and the Rio Nueces. And that's a subject of contention. Mexico insists that the boundary between Texas and Mexico is the Nueces River, which is further north. And the Texans say it's the Rio Grande, which is to the south. So there's some territory in between there that both sides are claiming. Now remember, Mexico, first of all, says that the whole business of the annexation of Texas is illegal because that was Mexican territory. The United States can't just annex Mexican territory. And that the Republic of Texas was not a legal entity. They've never accepted it, they've never recognized it, but they say if it does exist, the border is the Nueces. So to agitate things, Polk sent his ordered General Taylor to go into that territory and occupy it and just see what happens, and maybe there'll be some incident or something, and then he can use that. Well, okay. So the troops go in there, and as Polk had hoped, the American troops patrolling in disputed territory encountered some Mexican troops also patrolling in disputed territory. They both claim that that territory is theirs, and whose it is, there's no settlement of that. The whole subject has never been negotiated, has never been officially accepted. There's no actual law because Mexico never accepted Texas, and they never accepted the annexation. So there's no law, there's no treaty, there's no agreement on whose territory that is. Both sides are just claiming it. And as expected, American troops and Mexican troops exchanged fire, and there were some casualties on both sides. All right. Meanwhile, Polk has decided to go ahead and ask Congress for a declaration of war against Mexico. His reasons for doing so are really troublesome. He's going to have a hard time selling this idea to Congress because the things he's going to use are, well, he's going to make a big deal of the fact that Mexico had insulted us when they refused to accept Slidell as our negotiator. Well, Slidell just went down there. He had no legal status. Mexico had not accepted him. Mexico's position was, we have broken off relations with the United States. We have no diplomatic relations. We have no ambassador. What is he doing here? He doesn't have a right to come here. He can't just show up and then we have to welcome him. They refused to welcome him. They refused to accept him. Yet Polk is going to try to make that into some big deal and make that the insult to the United States of not accepting Slidell, he's going to try to make that as grounds for war. But he knows that Congress is going to be very reluctant to support a war on that basis. That's just not going to be a successful operation. He's pretty well sure that the Whigs in Congress are going to vote against that, and they're never going to allow him to get away with that. But he's going to try to make that into a speech. He's working on a speech. He's trying to write that in some way to make it sound like it's really a horrible thing that Mexico has done, and that's grounds for war, and he's trying to make the most of it. But it's a stretch. He's having a hard time finding a way to draft that in a way that's going to be convincing. He's also going to use the fact that Mexico owed some money to us, and that's a complicated issue, but in fact, Mexico has admitted that they owe money to us. And they have said, send us a negotiator and we'll discuss this and we'll work this out and we'll agree, we'll work out a way for us to pay the debts that we owe to the United States. So they've accepted that. And theoretically, Slidell went down to negotiate those issues, but he came down there not just to negotiate those, he came down there to buy California. And so the Mexicans said, wait a minute, we're only waiting to have somebody come and negotiate the debts, and you're not here to negotiate debts, you're here to buy California. So no, you can't, we won't negotiate with you. But Polka's going to try to make it sound like Mexico's refusing to take responsibility for their debts. He's going to try to make that into a big reason why we have to go to war against Mexico. They owe us money and they won't pay us. Well, they've agreed to pay us, and if we just send somebody down with instructions to negotiate, to work on the debt, yeah, we could work that out. But he doesn't do that. But anyway, he's going to make a big issue of the fact that Mexico has refused to negotiate with this. And he's going to try to make some other things about some other insults to us, but man, he's going to have a hard time, and he knows it. He's working on draft after draft, and he's trying to find some way to make a big mountain out of a molehill and find some way to get Congress to declare war. And then he receives the word that Mexican troops and the United States troops have engaged in a shooting match in that contested territory between the Nueces and the Rio Grande. So he drafts a speech in which he says, American blood has been shed on American soil. Well, it's not exactly American soil. He says it's American soil, but there's no legal facts backing that up. There's no legal formal recognition of American access to that land, but he's going to claim that. And so he makes this big thing about how Mexican troops had attacked innocent American troops and on American soil. And on that basis, he gets Congress to declare war against Mexico. I'm not going to spend time, and I'm looking at the time here, I don't really have time to get into the war. Just to make a long story short, the United States did win the war, and we signed a treaty that gave us the whole southwestern territory, and we paid Mexico some money. I can't remember the number. I think it was like $15 million. The U.S. agreed to pay the debts that were owed to Americans by Mexico, but we acquired all that territory. And then the big question is, and if I had more time, then this would be this issue, because guess what? There's going to be a big whole issue about slavery in that territory. Now we've got more territory. We have to figure out what to do about slavery. You know, when we've been dealing with the whole issue of slavery by dividing it. We know that. We know that the first big block of territory we acquired from England in the Treaty of 1787, when we, or 1783 rather, the Treaty of Paris, when we got our independence, and we got that territory west of the Appalachians, and we ended up dividing that along the Ohio River. And then we acquired Louisiana, and we ended up dividing that along 3630. Now we're going to acquire all this territory. And, in the case of some of these other places, we had some time to work on this because there weren't any settlers there. What happened in California was, of course, that about the same time we signed the treaty, the Americans living in the Central Valley discovered gold. There's a big, huge gold rush. And here we acquire California, and then almost instantly, it's ready for statehood. There's not going to be any sort of waiting time as there was, in the Louisiana territory. It was many years before Missouri was ready for statehood, but California's ready immediately, and California wants to become a free state. So that's going to lead to a whole another debate over the status of slavery in California, but that's an issue that I just don't have time to take, so I'll just have to stop here. Now, your question for the lecture today is, Why did John Slidell go to Mexico in 1846?